Okay, everyone. Today also, or again, we are together with Marx Capital Volume 3 lecture series led by political economists and activists Andrew Higginbottom. So building on the earlier Volume 2 and Volume 3, 2 and 1 series, it examines Marx Capital Volume 3, the process of capitalist production as a whole, where production, circulation, profit, credit, and land are analyzed together as a single system. So today's course, again, lecture 3 is about prices and profit system. Andy, thanks for joining us today again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And once again, Tinep, and thank everybody, the team at the CSSGJ, which really appreciated the platform and your sort of facilitation of this whole process. So we have the monthly lecture and we have two weekly reading groups going. And I've certainly learned a lot from the discussions generated in the reading groups. So this week, I'm going to introduce chapters 6 and 7. And I'm also going to do a short review of what we looked at in the last month. And I'm going to actually, I've been asked to comment on how my approach relates to the general literature on volume 3. So that's a new section. And as a sort of like a sidebar, which is not really a sidebar because it's quite important, we've also been discussing value composition. So I'll come on to that. And if there's time, I'll go into a bit more detail about Engels and turnover. So let's start with the review. Basically, in chapters 1 and 2, we're looking at an individual capital and how surplus value becomes profit. And it's quite important that at this stage in the argument, the surplus value and the profit are same in magnitude. What's happening is much more a qualitative inversion rather than quantitative change. And it's really all about the profit form. And the profit form is how surplus value actually appears, especially how it appears to capital, and it appears as an extension of capital rather than something which has been generated by labor creating additional value. And the sort of the focus of this inversion is just, it's very formal. It seems like a very small, purely formal sort of distinction. And that's how the commodity form is represented. So Marx represents the commodity form mostly in volume 1 as C plus V plus S. And what he's really saying is that the V plus S is the new value. That's the essence of the relationship. The workers add new value. And the degree to which they're exploited is the S over V. But the V plus S is the entire new value, and the C is the constant capital which is used up. Now, what Marx does is he says, well, we can also look at this, and capital does, in terms of the way it appears. And it appears as C plus V, bracketed here, which is the cost. So it's the cost of wages, the cost of the raw materials, cost of the machinery that is used up, plus a profit. So this is a relationship of essence and appearance he's talking about here, right? Now, the cost plus profit form, the C plus V plus P, hides the labor exploitation. It also, and this is really the same point said differently, it hides the class antagonism between capital and labor. And it hides what the real source of the new value is, right? So there's a lot of hiding going on in this change of form, right? And we looked at this a bit deeper, and it was quite an interesting discussion about valorization. And valorization has definitely got a dual meaning. Labor valorizes, but also capital valorizes. It self-expands itself, right? Double relationship. Now, in chapter 3, he moves on to how not surplus value and profit, but the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. And the formula is really clear. It's very well established by Marx. He discusses it in many different ways. He sort of pulls it and pushes it, pokes around on it, but it stays. I mean, it's robust. And what he's saying is the surplus value converts into the rate of profit in the following way. The rate of profit is equal to the rate of surplus value, that's the S over V, times an expression of what he calls the value composition. And the way it's expressed here, the V over big C is the variable capital over the total constant capital advance. Now, we'll have occasion to come back to this quite a lot, but the basic structure is very clear. You have two terms multiplied by each other to reach the rate of profit, rate of surplus value, and an expression of the value composition. Now, what's also interesting in chapter 3 is that Marx, without any sort of comment or complication, includes wages as one of the things that will change the rate of surplus value. And you might think, well, that's hardly worth comment because clearly if workers are paid less, they're more exploited. But it's exactly that relationship which he generally excludes from his theoretical expression of surplus value in volume 1. So it's a welcome inclusion because it's right. I mean, it does increase the rate of surplus value, right? It doesn't yet comment on labour productivity, and it is interesting just reflecting on this. The flow of this argument has got some similarities with the movement of his argument in volume 1. Of course, what he's done, he's established a concept of profit as such. Volume 1, it's the concept of surplus value as such, as a sort of an outline concept. And now he's moving into how it sort of dimensions its determination, if you like, right? And that's what he's doing here with profit as well. So he starts off with the overall formula. He looks at the S over V component. And then when he moves on into chapters 4, 5, and 6, he's really looking at the value composition component, how that might change and how that might affect the overall rate of surplus value. So it's not fully signposted, but I would say it's very, as Marx usually is, right, very methodical and systematic. So the annual rate of profit is the surplus value produced in a year, because it's an annual rate of profit, over the capital advance to achieve that result. So the capital advance, in actual fact, what businesses do is they take the average over the year, but for the time being, we just assume at the beginning of the year. Okay. So the rate of profit is the surplus value that the workers produce in a year, but appears as profit over the capital invested to achieve that. So it's a relationship between living labor and capital, which is dead labor. Okay. Now, as we've already seen, this is broken down into two factors, right? So the overall expression is surplus value over capital advanced, but we break it down into these two components. Now, one point now, right? The S over V times V over C, mathematically, the two V's have to be the same. If they're not the same, then we're changing what the formula is, right? And the surplus value is the surplus value from a year's production. Therefore, the variable capital must be the variable capital which is applied during the year to get that same is the variable capital which is applied all the way through the year to get the result. Okay. Now, this variable capital is not the same as the variable capital advanced, because the variable capital advanced is what's applied during one turnover. After one turnover, the goods are sold, the money comes back, and the money's reinvested. So if the turnover is more frequent than once a year, then the advance needed to keep production moving is less. And so there's a definite relationship between the two. The variable capital advanced is the variable capital applied in the whole year divided by the number of times it turns over during the year. And this is the number, this is the end, right? So we have a rate of turnover, which is of the circulating capital, includes both variable capital and raw materials, basically, which is the circulating constant capital. Okay. Now, what I'm demonstrating and arguing, if you like, is that the rate of turnover does not affect the real rate of surplus value. What it affects is the rate of turnover of circulating capital affects how much capital has been advanced to get this result, any given result, any given rate of profit, right? Okay, so the rate of turnover affects the circulating capital required for any given scale of production. And it affects the capital advance because the capital advance is a combination of fixed capital and the circulating capital that's been advanced. So as the turnover becomes more rapid, so less and less circulating capital advanced is needed. It doesn't affect the fixed capital either. So all you've got is a lot of focus then on the effect of turnover on the circulating capital advanced. And as it reduces, then the overall capital advance will also reduce, but not so quickly because it's only one part of the advanced capital. Okay, so this is the formula with the effect of the turnover of the circulating capital. And you can plug that in into the overall expression. So this is my modification, and it's an alternative to Engels. I think he makes some mistakes here, to be frank, right? He's on the right track, but he doesn't get it quite right. And I think this is, yeah, my take on it, basically, which I hope proves the test of critique. Um, so here we are. This is how the rate of profit in a fuller sense, how we've now included, basically, we've included the rate of turnover with our basic formula. So now the rate of profit is the rate of surplus value times the value composition of capital, taking into account the effect of the rate of turnover. Okay. So that's the review. If we have time, I'm going to come back just to expand on some of the points in relation to Engels, but I don't want to dwell on that for now. I want to get into the new material first. Okay. So as I mentioned, chapter 5 really concentrates on the effect of increased labor productivity. And as is well established in volume 1, the driver of capital to increase labor productivity is to make more profit, is to sell more commodities that capture a bigger share of the market and to sort of undercut their rivals. But the overall effect, if you like, the social effect of this is that capital does succeed in increasing labor productivity and cheapening commodities. Okay, so a rise in productivity in one branch cheapens commodities in other branches where commodities enter as means of production, and therefore an increase in the rate of profit. So once again, what Marx is looking at here is ways in which it's not due to an increase in surplus rate of surplus value. It's due to a cheapening of the constant capital. In other words, less capital is required to be invested to get a given result. If the inputs are cheaper, then capitalist doesn't have to spend so much money to keep the workers in motion and get them producing. Okay. Now, this is a moving contradiction, which Marx will come back to time and time again, right? Because although the increase in labor productivity involves an expansion of the raw materials, bigger machines, if you like, a larger sort of capitalist infrastructure around the workers. That's true, but the degree to which the value of that increases, it will increase, but not so much as their scale, because they themselves are being made more cheaply. So what we have, and Marx uses some interesting points here, right? He's talking about, although there's an expansion of production with this larger, more capital-intensive production, and even if there's more workers, there's relatively fewer workers compared to the scale of production. And interestingly, he starts in place of what he normally says is means of production. He calls them means of exploitation, which I think is quite apposite, actually. And what we noticed reading through this is he's bringing in the collective alienation of the workers. Now, I mentioned earlier that these chapters follow very broadly the structure of volume 1. An actual fact, this chapter in particular almost traces it step by step. So Marx starts off here with the concept of cooperation, and then he moves on to machine-led production and so on. And basically, he's retracing those steps, but now on the basis of production for profit. And for example, the concept of cooperation, it's very clear in a capitalist system, capitalists can take advantage of cooperation, but cooperation is in heavily inverted commas here because it's really forced. I mean, it's a class imposition on the workers. And again, he raises a topic which he has raised before, which is the co-option of science as a lever of increasing productivity in the interest of capital. And, that is an area of discussion, how much it's directly instrumental and how much autonomy the scientific community has and so on, right? So that's all to do with social productivity. And the other big theme in this chapter is cost cutting. And it's very striking. The very first type of cost that Marx looks at is costs at the worker's expense, health and safety of the workforce. We can add other things as well, which he doesn't directly speak about, but there's no theoretical difficulty from what he's already established. I mean, it's really important, the reduction of costs in extractive industries, which we see all over the world today. They don't pay for the full effect. If it's not the workers' expense, it's the community's expense, or it's the expense of the planet, if you like. They don't invest to remediate the full effect of the production, avoid pollution, and so on. So what Marx is saying here is by cutting costs, again, capitalists can reduce their outlay. Now, I do think that this has got a very heavy potential link with imperialism. And I do think that this is also very heavily dependent on his leading example. And it is worth remarking on this, how much Marx uses the example of cotton. So he gives these figures for how much circulating capital is. And notably here, of the £358 advanced to circulating capital, £342 of it, i.e. basically 90%, was spent on cotton as the raw material. This is in the spinning industry, which again is his leading example. So he's saying that you can, well, Engels adds a comment, right, about the abnormal high rate of profit is due to very cheap cotton prices. So this is hidden in plain sight, is the dependency of the industrial capitalist revolution on cotton produced by slaves in the US South, basically. Chapter 6 is also looking at fluctuations in the prices of raw material. This is very interesting. It does relate to circumstances today with the question of the oil supply, global oil supply, and the Straits of Hormuz. And he looks at foreign trade, and he has got it's not really a fully direct critique, but he's got an indirect critique here of Ricardo's position on foreign trade. And he'll come back to this later on, by the way, in volume 3, right? So he's got comments on tariffs and import duties as well, because if you reduce tariffs, then it's cheaper raw materials for the capitalist. And again, this is very stimulating in terms of connecting it with theories of imperialism, because in actual fact, what we're talking about by and large is low material prices coming from what we today call the global south, right? And cheap food for the workers and cheap raw materials for industrial capital. And this is precisely the cornerstone of Marini's argument about the self-reproducing nature of imperialist relations extending from the capitalist mode of production in a situation of free trade in the mid-19th century. So this is sort of like, if you like, in that sense, a post-colonial reproduction of imperialist type political economy. Marx writes more about the productivity of labor, and this is extending the point that I made earlier, which is that the size and value of the machines employed grows as the productivity of labor develops, but not in the same proportion as this productivity itself, i.e. the proportion to which these machines supply an increased product. This is quite a subtle point, but it turns out to be very important, right? So what he's saying is that increased productivity, there's more use values being produced by the labor because, bigger and better machines, right? And more raw materials is a direct index of this as well, because the raw materials are just keep on flowing at a greater rate. But the machinery, its material productivity increases, but the actual value of the machines don't go up so much. That's what he's saying. He also uses, once again, I hadn't noticed this before, right? Once again, cotton is the leading example of how much raw material is important. The growth of the production of raw material is a necessary consequence of the growth of productivity of labor in industrial capitalism. And again, he's got the example of cotton to show the cost of cotton in Manchester at the time. Well, you can could work it out per pound, 7 pence. It was actually sold in New Orleans at the time for 10 cents, which is about 5 pence. So this is a cheap mass volume product already, right? He looks at how if you've got a change in price of the raw material, what effect that will have on the industrial capital. And sometimes it will allow more capital to be released. I mean, if a capitalist is owning a lot of raw material whose price goes up, then in effect they've had a windfall increase in the value of their capital. On the other hand, if they have to buy a load of raw materials and the price goes up, then they've lost. And the inverse if the price goes down. So if they're holding a lot of stock and the price goes down, then the capital is actually losing. The exchange value is going down. So the movements of price do affect profitability. And what's interesting here is he says it doesn't actually matter if the price movement is just due to sort of the vicissitudes of supply and demand or changes in the underlying productivity of labor producing them. Their effect on profitability, that's inconsequential. If the input prices go down, that will increase profitability. If the input prices go up, that will make it more capital will be needed to be invested. Okay. And of course, again, there's a lot of contemporary relevance to this in terms of the world economy now. And as a result of US imperialism, we've got uh, dollar barrels going up, oil barrels going up. This holding of commodities depends on the industry, can actually be really quite important in terms of how much the value of the capital invested in production actually is, because you've got all these sort of stocks. And this is an example I actually take from the annual reports of Anglo-American Corporation from 2 years ago now. And I just looked at this dimension of their accounting, and they actually hold $7 billion worth of sort of commodities in different stages of production. So if the prices go up or down, they're going to gain or lose accordingly, right? So capitalists keep a track of this. It's part of their money of account in their production process. Right. Oh, sorry, I commented on this quote already. This is the matter of indifference, he says, whether prices go up or down due to fluctuations in value. I mean, this is turns out to be an important point, just in terms of the debate about what's really going on with the transformation problem. Okay. He's not really too worried about why input prices going up or down in terms of calculating the rate of profit for the capitalist which is using those commodities. So what we have is quite a long discussion. Now, I'm not going to pick it all apart, but there is quite a long discussion here in this chapter of the price dynamics. You get a real sense of movement of the system, right? So we've already touched on how introducing machines to increase labor productivity. He again is very similar to the treatment in volume one. Bringing in machines can often and usually makes the worker's life worse, not better. They have to work longer hours, have to do shift work. Of course, the capitalists want to sweat. They want to realize the value of the expensive machinery. He also says that very often there's a sort of like a bleeding edge. The first capitalists to introduce the machines may not be the ones that really make the big profits. Um, and he's also talking about the effect of machinery increasing the productivity means decreasing the value of commodities. And if those commodities are being consumed by workers, he's supposing that means that they'll have lower wages, and that means that all the capitalists can get a higher surplus value. So this is also discussed in chapter 12 of volume one. So what we've got is a lot of dynamic movement here. Okay. So he's exploring the tendencies of movement of the mode of production as a whole. I'm saying this because I want you to be conscious that he's moving away from the individual capital towards how the system as a whole is working, right? And certainly the next part where he discusses the cyclical movement of raw material prices, again, incredibly pertinent to contemporary concerns, right? His leading example is cotton. And he's saying, well, look, the main supply comes from US South, but if that supply is interrupted in some way, and it was, then the capitalists in Britain will be looking for other sources. And so they did turn to India and later to Egypt as well. But if it reopens in the US, then they'll drop India and Egypt and go back to their main supply. He's just looking at these dynamics of um, dominating control of the capitalist market There is, he doesn't use the terminology, but there is a sort of an opening here to think about dependency. I mean, the cotton producers in the US and in India, in this case, are very much dependent on how the market moves in the UK in terms of the demand for their products and so on, right? Uh, and he also, he's mentioning, and this point comes up a lot later on in volume three, and most of the later on, they're inserts by Engels, right? But this is the point at which free competitive capitalism, so-called industrial capitalism, is becoming more and more, tending more and more towards cartels and monopolies, which Engels does comment on a lot. And Marx is also spotting this as well. He's saying, look, the industrialists don't sit back. If raw materials become dearer, then they start to, they start to make moves to make sure that that doesn't affect them in the same way, right? Okay. So, yeah, there's a lot of points in this, and I don't really do it justice, but I hope that you read it and bring out more points, I'm sure. This general illustration of the cotton crisis is, again, it's a bit like volume one. He's illustrating these dynamics of industrial capitalism and raw materials and the cotton crisis. So we had the Civil War in the United States, right? What was happening up to that point is a huge increase in cotton production, huge increase in the industrial consumption of cotton. This is Marx looks at this and he traces it in terms of dynamic cycles, industrial cycles, and he's sort of saying, that it's not like a simple movement, without what's the word, unproblematic. He's saying, look, although there's great industrial expansion, it was also quite problematic in terms of the tendency towards a repetitive cycle, boom and bust, right? So and that's what he's tracing empirically in this part. And then he does come to the Civil War in the United States, and he's basically pointing out that the interruption of the supply, because the North blockaded the export of cotton from the South to the UK, meant that there wasn't a supply of cotton, or it's drastically reduced. And so there was basically a big downgrade of production in Lancashire in particular, and Manchester. And so a lot of workers were laid off or were put on very reduced wages. And then they looked to India and they tried to find other sources, right? And Marx is again, he's looking in detail at that. And he's saying basically the cotton from the US was very highly developed in terms of its industrial use. The cotton from India was more developed for artisanal use, and so it wasn't perfectly matched to industrial use. And so the machinery using the raw materials had to be, it's interrupted a lot. There were breakages and so on the thread. So this meant that the workers lost time and they lost money. As well as because they were actually being paid less by the capitalists. And he gives the example of that, right? Workers' wages were reduced, depending, but by about a third or even to a half. Now, the background to this is worth commenting on because, of course, Marx and Engels, I mean, the US Civil War is important, not just because Marx and Engels commented on it, but that's the angle that I'm coming on in here. It's hugely important in world history. Um, but they did comment on it, and they had a kind of a dual position, I have to say, right? On the one hand, they did send through the First International message of congratulation to Abraham Lincoln, but that wasn't their only position. They also, in particular, thought that the war would only be won if there was an uprising of the enslaved African Americans in the South as well. They wanted to see the war take a revolutionary turn, but they thought it was a needed turn, if you like, in order to succeed. And their position, I think, quite independently, or maybe not, I don't know, it's quite similar to that of W.E. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction. So they commented a lot on the US Civil War, is what I'm trying to say. They followed it as closely as they could. Of course, the reports weren't fantastic, but they followed what they could. But this had quite a big effect on politics in the UK because the huge importance of these supplies cannot be understated. This is the primary industry of the Industrial Revolution. It's really well documented in Hobsbawm's book, and you can see the rise of not only New Orleans but also and Liverpool, which it's famous for, actually the financial side really affected the rise in New York and London as well. Now, so because there was a blockade of the cotton exports, the UK ruling class wanted to break the blockade. If you like, the Farage wing was quite open about it, and the sort of the centre right were discussing it quite seriously. I mean, magazines like The Economist were arguing for a breaking of the blockade, right? The cotton manufacturers were looking elsewhere for supplies. They did introduce massive layoffs, massive hardship in northern England, working class districts. Now, so the right in England tried to mobilize the suffering of the working class as a moral argument against the civil war. Our workers are suffering. Why should we support those people over there? So it's actually a very reactionary argument. But the workers did resist. I mean, they didn't go on strike. It's wrong to portray this as a conscious action of strike. But at the same time, they also refused to be used in this ruling class sort of racist project as well. Mm. Okay, the supplementary remarks. There are three supplementary remarks. The first is that he emphasizes a point already made, which is the capitalist forgets production and sees value being added in the process of realization, i.e., in the sale of the commodity. This again is extremely important in terms of uh, what we think of imperialism today. And what basically the capitalist thinks that it's their entrepreneurial skill that adds value. And Marx is quite aware of this. And this is sort of like there is a degree of contingency about this. I mean, some capitalists might be better at being capitalists than others, right? But of course, this sort of variation doesn't explain the underlying relationship, but it does explain some degree of variation of it. Okay. So there's a connection between necessity and contingency here. So the second supplementary remark which Marx makes is about expanding the scale of production. And this again happens to be something that David Harvey writes about a lot. And he's saying, look, as capital expands, what happens to the rate of profit? Well, prima facie, it can expand to the same degree, and therefore there'll be the profits can expand to the same degree, and therefore we have the same rate of profit. We'll find out that that's not actually necessarily the case at all, but that can be the case, right? And then he has a comment on socially necessary labor time. Um, and he's just re-emphasizing the point is it's not what time it takes to produce something that matters, it's the time it takes to reproduce it. And that's important when you've got swift changes in technology, of course. In other words, to replace something, you have to look at what it would be to replace it now rather than what it took to produce it before. Okay, if you happen to be watching a recording, you can take a break now because that's already one big chunk. Why roll over Beethoven? Well, turn over, rolled over. Don't. Yeah, that's as far as I got with that connection. But anyway, okay. The literature. We have got Marini Spagnolo's university course guide, now translated into English. I'm not yet. I'd like people to have a look at it and see if they find it helpful. Beverly Best has brought out a full book on dedicated to interpretation of volume 3. And I think she does make a lot of good points in the right direction. I think she's got a good grasp of the importance of the dynamic of essence and appearance and this thing about inversion at the beginning of the book. But there are quite a lot of things at the same time that she misses. I mean, she doesn't really follow through on how this volume connects with the two earlier volumes of Capital. And she kind of like doesn't really get much into political economy, to be honest with you, right? So, for example, she misses the distinction between capital advanced and capital used up. And this is a little bit surprising for a scholar looking at this, she doesn't take account of Marx's later two rounds in the mega notebooks either, right? Okay, so there is a good point that she's making, which is that the early chapters are about the question of essence and appearance and the inversion, right? But the further point to delve into is inversion of what? And I don't think she really brings out the class antagonism that's underlying it, right? So, and what I'm saying methodologically, if you like, is she's good on form determination, but you also need essence determination to link with the form determination. So what is being inverted? What is being transformed? And I make similar points here. I don't read all of that out. Okay. I think that Best does make good points, right? But I think where the weak points are is all linked with how you interpret the transformation problem itself, which we'll come on to next time, right? Um, but I think she's got a fairly conventional view, actually, of the transformation problem. Um, She's right about the importance of fetishism and right to raise the issue of capital fetishism. Because if you think of fetishism as was normally understood, it's of the commodity. The commodity appears as the object, which contains, which its attributes are social relations. Well, it's the same with capital, but even more so. It appears that capital produces value. That's the critical fetishism of capital, right? Capital creates jobs. Capital brings jobs. Capital gives us technology. Capital adds value. This is all capital fetishism, all robbed from the workers. I got problems with Harvey and Heinrich. I just got my eye on my watch now, so I have to leave this for documentation to a large degree. Harvey has got a circulationist approach to the three volumes of Capital and to capitalism in general. He sees production, he doesn't ignore production, but he subsumes it to the circulation of capital. This is very clear in his companions to Capital, but also in his very latest book, which is just out. He's confirming his circulationist approach. But the other thing is his view of imperialism. Well, he's kind of like oscillates between two views, or maybe three. I don't know. First of all, imperialism does involve dispossession. There's no question of that. But it doesn't only involve dispossession. It also involves the production of surplus profits, basically. And the mechanism of production are part of imperialism. The second area is that he actually has debated with several of our own comrades, Rada, John Smith. He rejects the concept of superexploitation, and he wrote a supplement to the Patniak's book on imperialism, making that very clear. He thinks that the concept of imperialism, or at least he did, think it was outdated. He's in and out on the politics, to be honest with you, and his latest book is a bit more radical than what he was saying there, I have to say. In terms of what he now writes about Volume 3, up to this point in his very extensive oeuvre, Harvey hadn't commented on parts 1, 2, and hardly on 3 very much of Volume 3. He does now, but what he says is extremely conventional, I have to say, and I don't think very insightful. Um, but he has got a debate with Roberts about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And as part of that debate, he joins in the critique of Engels, which I think is almost entirely unfounded in terms of Engels distorting Marx's argument on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Right. So if best was the good, these are the bad. And we've not yet come on to the ugly. Heinrich's introduction, again, it's pretty conventional, to be honest with you. I think he makes a few mistakes, but not big ones. But again, overall, he's got an emphasis in his interpretation on circulation, uh, exchange value in terms of circulation. And I think that there is a social root to these two positions. I do think it comes from Marxism coming from the imperialist region where we are more and more distant from most material production. But also, I think, which, that's an objective reality, but also I think in terms of their positioning, they they avoid determinacy. They don't want to see that Marx's argument leads to the necessity of crisis in capitalism. And actually, I mean, politically, that's economic, if you like, right? Politically, it means that working class will always be defeated, which he doesn't write that in Capital, but that is the obvious political consequence of his economic argument. Working class will always be defeated within capitalism, right? Because the only solution to the crisis is massive defeat for the working class within capitalism. So I think they're both, theoretically laying the basis for not supporting that position, really. Uh, I don't say these guys are ugly. That's just a little internal joke, I suppose. Mosley is also worth looking at. He has edited the first round, the main notebook from which volume three is drafted. Again, I think he's a bit unfair to Eccles, I have to say. Um, Mandel's introduction to the volume which we're reading, he doesn't pay attention to the profit form in the way that I have done and Best has done. Um, he takes a lot of effort writing about surplus profit without really establishing profit, in my view, right? And again, I think he's quite conventional in other respects. And of course, in kind of like, he's an author of the convention. He's an influential author for sure. And some of our own comrades, again, have made helpful contributions in this area. Walter, Ed, Tim. So you can look those up or you can speak to them even. There's two things to read forward in volume three if you're interested. The last chapters of volume three are very good on what I've been talking about, capital fetishism, written by Marx himself. This is supremely important in terms of counteracting bourgeois ideology. And as John has pointed out in relation to the World Bank, John Smith critiques the World Bank for the idea of value added, quite rightly, because they're basically saying capital adds value, and actually you can find that in all the financial textbooks, right? Who creates value? Corporations create value, is what they're saying, right? So this sort of thing about the surplus value form to the profit form is supremely important in terms of capitalist ideology. Capitals are the creators of value as far as they're concerned, right? So reading the last chapters of this is helpful in those terms. Engels' contribution is really as an historian in many bits of volume three. He puts in a lot of interesting little inserts as we go later chapters, right? And in his supplement, he has two sections, one of which is about the historical rise of capitalism. And the one that I actually find most interesting is the very last pages, which is his supplement on the rise of imperialism. And the very last words of voluntary capital concern one Cecil Rhodes. So that's quite incredible. Okay, so in about 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about value composition. Value composition is something to do with the production process in the first instance, right? Because the production process is both the production of use values, which is concerned with the materiality of the production process, right? So you've got cotton, you've got machines, and you've got workers using those machines on the cotton, right? So that's a material, the cotton spinning yarn is a use value. It's useful. Yarn is a useful thing, right? But at the same time, it's a valorization process. In other words, as well as producing use values, the capitalist labor process produces exchange values. Even more than that, it produces surplus value, right? But you have this duality going all the way through. Now, active labor is paid for in circulation. Wages belong to circulation. And what the capitalist gets is a transformation of his variable capital, which is originally in the money form. The capitalist pays the workers' wages. That's the variable capital. But the capitalist gets something for it. They get the use of the labor power. Now, the labor power becomes an element of productive capital. The workers come into production. They're standing there or they're at their workbench, whatever, and they are part of productive capital. Their labor power is now going to be expended in production, right? So, and it's the active labor which converts the commodities and converts the content capital and produces the commodities, right? So we have this duality all the way through. Okay. Now, this is the context for the composition of capital. Productive capital has got a functional form. It's one of the forms of capital in production. And once again, we've got the materials and we've got the machinery. This is the means of labor and the object of labor. Okay. And then we've got the variable capital, which is the labor power itself. Okay. And Marx, as we well know, groups these as constant capital and variable capital, basically, right? Now, variable capital, and people often miss this, I have to say, right? Variable capital is part of the metamorphosis of capital. In other words, it too changes its form. It starts off as wages, then it starts off incarnated, if you like, as the labor power is expended and variable capital is transmuted into a part of the new value of the commodity product. So it's actually within the form of commodity capital, the C plus V plus S. It's the V of the C plus V plus S, right? So variable capital changes its form. Now, value composition is what are the relations in production, not of the product, in my view, right? So when Marx writes about value composition, he's talking about what's the relationship between these two elements of constant capital, machinery and the raw materials, and the labor power, which is using them to create new value, right? That's the proportion he's interested in. And because we're talking about in production, it's the capital advanced or laid out invested in the production that passes over into the actual process of production. It's the beginning, if you like, of the production process. And so this capital outlaid, he uses big C, and the capital outlaid is constant capital, small c, plus variable capital, small v. And you can express the relationship in, any one of those three proportions is all valid. Okay. Now, Engels gives us a real life example from page 169. And he comes up with a proportion of C over V of 15.8. Once again, I'm afraid I think he's slightly wrong because he's included the fixed capital, which is good, but I don't think it's the right V. I mean, it should be the V applied and the C applied, not advanced. Why? Because it's what's actually happening in production that is the materiality of the relationship. So this is quite, arguable, if you like, and subtle point, but I'll come back to this if we have time. Right. Okay. The technical composition of capital are the two material sides of labor productivity. How much material? The organic composition of capital now is how much that technical composition is reflected into and on the value composition. Right. This is a central concept for Marx. We've seen it already in volume one. He makes a major point about this in terms of the sort of mid chapters of volume one, after the Factory Acts were passed and limited to the working day. The emphasis of increasing surplus value, shift to relative surplus value, huge increase in machinery, huge increase in the organic composition of capital. Okay. He also uses it very fully in the dynamic in volume one of the general law of accumulation, which starts off by explaining this is the rising organic composition of capital, which generates reserves army of labor, which has its own law of population. So once again, we've got this increase in constant capital as compared to variable capital. Okay, as capital expansion occurs, as capital accumulates. Now, what you don't have in volume one is an internal explanation of crisis, right? This will come in volume three. How this ends in volume one is there's got like a historical, external, if you like, historical materials explanation, right? Which is what came into being will go out of being. It will be superseded, right? But here, it will go into crisis, and it's the crisis which generates the political forces which can actually bring about its end. So there are some confusions, I think, possible with organic composition of capital. You'd have to be clear what constant capital and what variable capital. In the first place, we're not talking about the capital consumed that ends up in the product, but they must be part of the capital used. Okay. Apparent simplification changes the nature of the transformation. This matters because most of the literature on the transformation problem takes the first position. They think the COV, organic composition, is about capital consumed, and it's not, right? It's about what's been used in its production, and they're not the same thing. They're similar, but not the same, right? So what happens, I think, is in a discussion of organic composition, the class issue gets lost, becomes relatively, seemingly quite technical. Now, the value composition can be different for more than one reason, right? We've realized that variable capital is an index of the labor power that's set in motion. In other words, if the wages are at a certain level, then we know how much labor power they're going to buy, and then hence how much living labor is set in motion. And we know that if your wages go down, that means that we can have more labor power for a given amount of variable capital and so on, right? So the ratio between C and V can change for a reason which is completely other than the technical composition. So a lower V for variable capital signals an increase in the exploitation, right? But a lower V also means that the value composition increases as well. So it has a double effect. Again, this is really important when we come to a theory of imperialism, right? And I'm going to anticipate a little bit, right? So we know from Marx that variable capital is an index of the total labor set in motion. Um, when it comes to the rate of profit, I think the value composition, and I've said this already, I'm kind of like restating it from this angle, from this perspective. The value composition that matters is a combination of the variable capital applied divided by the total capital advanced. And this is important when we come to the falling rate of profit to understand this. Okay, just one more thing. We're nearly finished, right? Um, the effect of turnover on the rate of profit. I will go through this fairly quickly because we're kind of like changes in, I'm going to come down to the bottom bit, right? Changes in the value composition can be due to three different reasons. They're all interconnected, but they're distinct. The first reason is changes in technical composition, as reflected in the exchange values of V and C, the organic composition. And what we mean here is how many workers are there, how much raw materials is passing through, how big the machines are, and so on, right? That's technical composition. And if that changes, it will be what's the word, a corresponding effect on the value composition. But it can also change because there's higher or lower wages. It can also change, that's the V, but it can also change because C changes. And turnover will affect how much C capital advance there is. Yeah, once again, I have a little adjustment to Engels, I'm afraid. Um, This last comment I think is quite important. There are two sort of cases where we can think of the rate of turnover changing. If a rate of turnover goes, I don't know, from 8 times a year to 9 times a year, that's a bit like we talked about before, is that one capitalist is being more efficient than another, right? They've managed to get their money back from selling more quickly than another capitalist in the same sector. It could be that their credit collection is better. It could be that they just managed to speed up production in some way, right? This sort of marginal gain, if you like, corresponds to a reality which you can easily, um, one can easily posit in terms of two capitals competing in a sector. It's a bit like the innovating capital with new machines. An innovating capital can make more profit than competitors simply by being more efficient in terms of their turnover, right? However, um, if you're talking about differences in turnover between sort of like 8 times a year and twice a year, right? This is a different category, right? Of this. This is not just marginal gains. We're talking about example being drawn from capitals in completely different industries, right? Because it takes a capitalist in locomotive building a lot longer to build and sell their locomotive than if they're spinning yarn. So, their rate of turnover, actually, Marx gives an example. It is surprisingly quick, I have to say. It's 4 times a year. I thought it'd be a lot longer. But he also talks about naval, takes over a year to build a ship, basically. So you're not going to get the money back. Well, actually, what they do, and this is interesting, right, is they build the ship in stages and they get the money back in stages. So they do actually find a way to increase their turnover. Right. But generally speaking, you've got these two different sort of situations, which at the level of abstraction of more or less turnover, we don't quite capture. You have to then follow it through to the real life examples. And there are two distinct situations. One is capitals competing within one sector, and then the difference between sort of typical capitals in two completely different sectors. Okay, I'm just really close to the end. I'm going to jump these now. I'm really sorry, but we can discuss them if you like. I'm very happy to discuss
We
them.
have the 5 minutes left,
Yeah,
Andy, for
yeah,
you.
5 minutes.
I
Thank
give
you.
you a little bit of time.
Thank you. Well, this always happens. Sorry. Um, Okay, I'm going to make one comment on this slide and one comment on the next slide, right? This is seemingly a very technical and abstract point. Okay, it actually turns out to be really important. Engels picks up something, not in these chapters, but later on, and he makes a very good point, which comes in from a notebook of Marx, the second of his three notebooks on this, right? So Marx comes back to this problem of turnover after his first draft when he's sort of reworking it a second time. And it is this relationship between the capital advanced and the cost, the capital which is consumed in the annual product. And what he states quite rightly is that there is a relationship, and that relationship is the turnover. And you can state the relationship one of two ways. So you can say the turnover period, which is probably the easiest way to state it, right? The turnover period equals the amount of capital advanced altogether divided by how much capital is used up and comes back as money in any given year. So in other words, if you've invested 200 million and the cost capital of your product in a year is 100 million, it's going to take you 2 years, well, the capitalists to get 2 years to get all their investment back. So there is a relationship, and this is really important, it turns out, when we come to the transformation problem, between the capital advanced and the capital consumed in the commodities produced. And I will without a doubt return to that one. And then my very last slide, last 2 minutes, is I was asked to, where do I sit? Well, uh, I do position myself consciously in the literature, but only after a long time of working it all out, right? And there are two major strands. On the one hand, there's the anti-imperialist sort of trend within Marxism on the left of this diagram. On the other hand is the more specialist stuff on the transformation problem. And in actual fact, I came from the anti-imperialist side. I wanted to work out how labor superexploitation works with the transformation problem. And it turns out that, first of all, to work out how labor superexploitation works, you've got to work out how labor exploitation works in the transformation problem. And it further turns out that in almost all of the orthodox readings, all orthodox Marxist readings of the transformation problem, it doesn't have any role to play at all. Because I think they've misframed the problem. And so I had to really go back a long way in the literature to pick up this train of thought. And I have. And I basically, the main writers that have influenced me on this are Rubin, Yaffe, Salama, and Tran Hai Hak in terms of a better orientation on the transformation problem. And so I'm going to argue a position which is completely different to most Marxist literature. Okay, which I think comes from Borkowitz rather than from Marx, um, and some of the more recent authors. And rather ironically, there's some aspects of Bohm-Beauvais, who was a very famous critic of Marx alongside Borkowitz. He actually brings in living labor time, which I think, although he's a critic of Marx and sees it as a inconsistency between volume one and volume two, three, I think it's right to bring it in, and I don't see it as inconsistent at all. I see it as a necessary contradiction, which is what Marx was writing about. And that is how the contradiction between capital and labor is disguised in the cost and profit form of capitalist commodities. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andy. It was really, really magnificent. And you're all the time, you're deciphering the details of capital reading, uncover all the details. So we can see it very well by your help. Thanks a lot. And now we start a question and answer session. Anyone who has a question, we can start. You can raise your hand by using the reactions. Yeah, one question. Tim Martin. Yes, Tim.
Oh, I was hoping someone else might get in first. To be, in all honesty, it's not a question. It's a congratulation to Andy for covering such ground in depth and breadth. But there is a question that you seem to be particularly enjoying the connections in this area. And if I can read you from having been in your reading groups for quite some time, you seem to be pulling together a whole bunch of strands in a fairly dynamic way. And it strikes me like as if it's coming together for you in your overview of some of these important analytic developments that I think we've been pointing to individually. I don't know whether that's fair at all, but
yeah, you're right. I mean, to be honest, I'm very pleased with something, and I don't know what's the word, pride comes before a fall kind of situation, but this thing about rate of turnover does seem to be highly technical, and like so what's the big deal, right? But actually, what I was struggling with, the problem is this, right? All of the standard literature on the transformation problem, they don't say how it happens. They kind of have this very weird and impossible idea that there's money paid in and out of a pool, right? To equalize the rate of profit, money moves around into and out of a pool. That's what David Harvey says, who is like the doyen of Marxism in his latest book, right? But it's magic. It doesn't happen, right? It doesn't happen like that, right? There is no in and out of a pool. And they also say it's an input output problem and so on and so forth, right? So I was really sort of wrestling with, so how does capital actually do this, right? And what it is that there's a rule imposed on each individual capital, right? So the general rule has to be enforced at the individual level, right? So what is the general rule? Well, the general rule, and I am slightly, between the objective and the subjective here, right? The general rule is the price is set, so you have a cost and you get a general rate of profit. Okay. So markup becomes really important. Okay, because what the capitalist does is they know their cost, and Marx has explained at great length that capitalists think cost is value, right? And they think profit is just their extra bit, right? So they don't actually have a living concept of value, right? What they have is cost plus profit. So, okay, if the market sets the price, then what they've got is price less cost equal profit, right? So you got these, basically those are the variables they work with, right? So maybe they can make more profit by reducing cost, or they could expand volume, right? But it's all about cost and profit, right? And the relationship between profit and cost operationally, for the operational side of capitalism, that's how they work, right? So the markup is a convention by industry. Okay, because different industries have got different structures of capital. They got different proportions of fixed and circulating capital. They got different rates of turnover. But for each industry, it becomes a rule of thumb how much you need to mark up on your cost in order to realize a certain rate of profit. Okay. And this is almost the same as what Marx says about the simple law of value. He says it operates behind the backs of of the producers, right? Well, it doesn't exactly operate behind the backs of the capitalist producers, but they have a realm of understanding which arrives at a result, which is, so Marx's explanation route, and I'll come on to it, right, is not actually how capitalists do it. That's my view. And I mean, this is a, tricky area now, right? Because I'm not just saying this is what Marx has said. I have an interpretation about what Marx did, right? And I will explain this as well, because we'll get into this. I mean, this is the big issue, right? When Marx did a lot of his investigation into the relationship between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit, he went down a massive blind alley, right? Which Engels edits out quite rightly, because it's a blind alley. So why should we all waste our time going down our blind alley, right? And the blind alley was, he was looking at the difference between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. So we know that the rate of surplus value must be greater than the rate of profit, right? Okay. So one way to think of their relationship is just look at their difference, right? But it's a blind alley, because what he actually otherwise fastened on is their relationship is an internal relationship, that multiplier, surplus value times value composition. That's not a difference, that's a relation. Okay, right? But Marx uses this same method of looking for difference in the transformation problem. And he actually is going down the same blind alley. So I'm not surprised that the interpretive literature has got, like, you know, I've got, what's the word, funny little diagrams of parrots pecking on nuts sort of thing, right? I mean, they've been all over the place for 100 years, right? Trying to work this out, right? And actually, Marx was slightly taking us down a blind alley, I'm afraid, right? So the wrong interpretation has got some validity based on the text, right? But the text, Marx was still working it out. He was a genius. He was the first one to pose the problem, right? But he hadn't quite got to the solution. He's got all the ingredients of the solution, and the ingredients are there at the beginning of volume 3, right? Which is you have to bring in labor time. You have to bring in labor time to explain the transformation of the substance of value into prices of production. And that will come in the next lecture. But so that I'm talking about, I've worked on for about the last 8 years, to be honest with you, right? But this thing about how do capitalists actually, because they don't think of, oh, I'm going to change the value to the price of production, right? How does it really work, right? But now I think we're close to getting to that as well.
Thank you, Andy. Any other questions? By the way, Richard shared something about Roberts engages with Harvey's latest book here, another review as
Yeah.
such, but an interesting read with a bunch of contextual link, which is called The Story of Capital. Oh, I'm ordered this book. Yeah, what everyone should know about how capital works. Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk about the Harvey Roberts debate. I mean, everybody's welcome to come in on this, right? Um, I mean, Roberts is better than Harvey on this, but I still think he's also got an issue. I also have an issue with his argument as well, right? But as capital accumulates, it gets bigger, right? So the profits get bigger. Marx's argument in the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is yes, the profits get bigger, but the rate of profit goes down. Because for any amount of capital invested, there's relatively fewer workers being employed, and it's the workers that create the new value and the surplus value, right? So in the end, this matters, right? You're going to come to a point, right, where the system reaches its own limit, right? Harvey doesn't like that. He really doesn't like that, right? And he uses about 3 different arguments against it, right? One is look over there. Look at circulation, surplus capital, look at all the different variables. One is Engels edited it wrong and made it much more determinate than it really is, which I think is completely false. I mean, I checked this, to be honest with you. I've been reading Harvey's book and checking what he does. All he does is, right, he makes references to the notebooks rather than to Engels' published version of them, right? 19 references to the notebooks. He's saying Engels distorted Marx's argument. All the references, 19, they're all the same in the notebooks as in the published volume 3, right? The only criticism you can make of Engels on this point is he inserted chapter headings and subheadings. I mean, that is a serious argument, right? Or not. But the other sort of argument he makes, right, and this is the debate with Roberts, is he says the mass of surplus value becomes more important than the rate of surplus value, right? I mean, yeah, well, you can look at it, see what you think. I just think, I don't know what to say. I find it hard to express this in words. This is supposed to be the leading Marxist in the world, right? And he can't even register a simple dialectical relationship. They both have to move, right? It's not one or the other, right? And he says that in a way, but in the end he says, yeah, well, and the clincher, I'll tell you the clincher with Harvey, right? The clinching argument in the correctly edited by Engels, part 3, is that the rate of profit tendency reaches a point of absolute limit. Okay. What is that absolute limit? Is it, so it starts at 10%. Does it get down to 3%, 2%, 0%? What is the absolute limit, right? Marx explains what the absolute limit is, right? It's not a given percentage as such. He says where any new investment does not generate more surplus value, right? That's the absolute limit. And that is completely determinate, right? It's not like, oh, it could be this, it could be that. That's emphatically the point of crisis, right? Because it's at that point that they attack full scale the working class, right? And the very last 2 words of that section of volume 3 is hence crisis. right? Hence crisis, right? So there is a theory of crisis there, right? In the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It's not fully extended and so on and so forth, right? But it is there. And also, by the way, I mean, some of the things that Marx writes earlier on about wages and so on, right? He's actually very perfunctory about lower wages as being an offsetting tendency of the rate of profit to fall in those chapters. I mean, there's just one page where he sort of says, well, they can do it with Negroes and coolies, which is right. I mean, sorry for the language, but it's like, you know what I mean, right? By exploiting, by super exploiting labor in colonized parts of the world, right? It's just one page, and it's really just half a paragraph because the other half is about trade, not investment, right? But what Marx has done in the earlier parts of Volume 3 is actually you could build a lot of that back in to Part 3, right? He does talk about wages being one of the factors in a higher or lower rate of profit, right? The trouble is, well, the issue is you just have to understand Mark. Well, we do, I think, understand Marx's methodology. He always looks at it one aspect at a time, right? So what he does is he starts off with wage levels being a major factor in the rate of profit, but that when he does a transformation problem, he simplifies it. It's like a first cut version, and he cuts out. We keep insisting it's the rate of surplus value and value composition, right? That's what we get from part one. In part two, he just looks at value composition, right? So it's just the first cut on his own premise. He should be also including different rates of surplus value, right? And once you do that, then the dynamic into the falling rate of profit becomes completely different, right? And that is the connection with imperialism.
Mhm. Thank you. One question, written question, Paraskevas. I have a question. Harvey argues that the mass of profit is more important than the rate of profit. I think that is not an accident that Marx pointed this last one as a driving force of the dynamics and a health of capitalism. What do you think?
Yeah, sorry, I think I got that. Well, I discussed it a bit. I mean, he slightly switched the emphasis of his argument. I think he switched it slightly in his latest book, but the debate with Roberts is Harvey says massive profit, Roberts says rate of profit, right? Basically, is the major factor, right? I mean, to answer this, also, you have to look at the way capitalism actually functions. I mean, Harvey in his book has lots of examples of increasing massive stuff, right? But the mass that matters are capital markets. And to think about this, we need to think about how the stock market works in terms of mass and rate, okay? Because the way the stock market works, I mean, I'm going to touch on that, but I'm only touching on it because I'm not still, I'm still trying to understand it as well, right? But there is a self-adjustment in it, right? So if a capitalist corporation is making a lot of profit, right, operationally, right, or they're projected to make a lot of profit, right, then that's return, that's profitability, right? But there's a mediation with the capital market, with the stock exchange, right? If that's the case, then their stock will go up, right? Which means that the return for those investors, the return on their investment is higher, right? Because they'll get both the utility and they'll get the appreciation of the capital, right? But then the market capitalization is increased, right? So if they get the same operational rate of profit next time, that will appear as a lower return on investment. I don't know if that makes sense, right? There's a weirdness about this, right? And when you're talking about the massive profit and the way the capitalist system really works, you have to bring in this distinction, right? Because the way capital is socialized is through capital markets, right? That's how the massive profit is actually realized, right? So you're talking about how does operationally generated profits become money capital of capitalist investors, right? And so I just think, but that I just think so far, I think the debate's a bit naive, to be honest with you. I don't know how else to put it. That seems very arrogant, but I don't think they're really engaging with Marx begins to write about this in part for part 5 of volume 3, right? How capital markets work, right? And I do think it will repay us a lot of attention to reread that, because he was struggling with something which was just happening as he was alive, right? I mean, that's why Engels' inserts are quite important, because Engels is saying, even in the last 20 years, it's changed a lot. You know what I mean? We have now got a lot of cartels and monopolies. Marx was massively optimistic about the joint stock company. He thought this is a social capital which can easily be transformed into social labor, association labor, right? Complete nuts, right? I mean, it's a bit like, no, it's a bit like the state before and after the Paris Commune. Do you know what I mean, right? There is no peaceful transition of the multinational corporation possible. They have to be smashed, right? They're not going to be like the organs of socialism, right? They're just not. They're capitalist hierarchies, right? So Marx was falsely optimistic, but it's to do with this sort of productivity of labor issue for him, right? They've increased the productivity of labor to a point which makes socialism sort of possible. But what Engels' later contributions is saying, yeah, but look what these guys are up to. Look what they're up to, right? And I do think we need more of that. That's all I'm trying to say, really, in terms of this rate and mass discussion, right? We need to look a bit more concretely about what this actually means in terms of way capitalism operates.
Thank you, Andy. I think there is no other written question. And John Smith, yeah, please go ahead, John.
Yes. Well, first of all, that was an absolutely wonderful lecture. So much in it, and brought a lot of things to life and a great triumph. And so, congratulations for that. I wanted just to refer back to something you said earlier in the early part of your talk, just to mention one thing that I'm sure you would.
John, I'm really sorry, a bit quiet. I don't know if it's just me.
Okay.
That's better already.
Okay, I'll try and speak a bit louder. Yeah, just one thing that I'm sure you would, if you'd have had time, have spent a bit more on, discussed a bit more, and that's the point where you said the value of the raw material forms an ever-growing component of the value of the commodity produced.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting, because just in terms of the whole discussion about imperialism, because if you just reflect on that statement alongside the way that the theory of unequal exchange developed, which was all about the value of the price of raw materials falling relative to the price of manufactured goods. So you had for a long period, maybe for most of the last century and a half, or at least since the beginning of capitalism's imperialist stage, you've had a structural long-term secular tendency for the price of raw materials, which mainly come from the global south, from oppressed nations, to actually decline relative to the price of the manufactured goods. So Fidel Castro talked about how 5 tons of coffee was required. You had to sell 5 tons of coffee to be able to buy a tractor, and then 5 years later you had to sell 13 tons of coffee to buy the same tractor. And so it shows how imperialism driving down the price of raw materials, and through extractivist exploitation in the ways that you've described it, became one of the ways to actually deal with this problem of the value of raw materials forming an ever-growing component of the value of the commodity produced, which has a depressing effect on the overall rate of profit. And kind of connected with that, I just wanted to ask you to comment on the importance of markup over production costs, which is basically gross profit. Markup over production costs is what the capitalists are most interested in. The markup over production costs can be considered gross profit, and from that markup they have to share different parts of it with other capitalists, with their creditors, and so on and so forth. But the markup over production cost is one area where imperialist social relations are actually extremely visible in full plain sight, and yet everybody ignores them. So my obsessive example of the £40 shirt from Marks and Spencer's, which only has a production cost of £1, and £39 of it appears in the gross domestic product of the country where this item is consumed. And it's all shared between different capitalists and even different labour. I mean, the point about that is that this is all on the surface, and if you actually look at it, well, I'll leave the point there because I don't want to take up the very
No, it's
limited amount
fine.
of
I
time.
mean,
But
your points are absolutely on point. Yeah. Well, on materials, I mean, one of the things Ernest Mandel and Michael Roberts, when they talk about the rising organic composition of capital, they use for that as the proxy for that the rise of fixed capital. Okay. I saying that that's a bias may not well be intentional, but it ends up with a Eurocentric view, right? Because what Marx said, I mean, I just spotted this on this reading, right? It's been there all the time. It's from Marx. He said it, right? He's saying that the index of labor productivity is more fully represented by the volume of raw materials in the constant capital, right? And you saw the numbers. I mean, his leading example is cotton. Over 90% of what we're talking about, the value composition, was the cotton, right? So yeah, the international. I mean, when we talk again, also when we talk imperialism, we are talking about modern imperialism, but this was also an imperialist relationship. I mean, capitalism has been imperialist all the way through, just taken on different type of imperialism, if you like, mercantile imperialism, free trade imperialism, and so on, right? So what we've got in Marx's day is a huge dependency on slave labor for the Industrial Revolution, right? So yeah, your point completely holds, right? In terms of markup, I think another thing to look at is this point of chains, commodity chains, right? And I do think volume 3 will help us with that as well, because when we get to industrial capital, commercial capital, I think that will help us once again with the commodity chain, right? Because if you've got very big capital invested as commercial capital, what Marx says is he sees commercial capital as an appendage of industrial capital. Yeah. So he's saying, look, it's more efficient for a capitalist, industrial capitalist, rather than to sell their own stuff. If the commercial merchant can do it more efficiently than they can, then why not sell it to them at a slightly reduced price? And they've got higher volume, they've got warehouse, or whatever. So they can get a better profit. So he says they should be included in the formation of the rate of profit, right? But not in the production of surplus value. So there's an interesting thing there, right? So, and I think that, international trade and, the relationship is not quite the same anymore, is it? As what Mark said, basically. And the whole question of the commercialization of the product is linked with what you're saying, John. I mean, so if the size of the capital in commerce is greater, even though they're not immediately producing or in charge of workers producing surplus value, they're going to claim an ever and ever greater part of the surplus value that has been produced, even, even as an equality of capitals, let alone bringing in monopoly and so on. Mm. Yeah, Richard.
Okay, yeah, Richard, this is our last question. Unfortunately, we are over time, but Richard, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, mine's quite mundane. Great lecture, thank you. My question is quite mundane. I'm not sure if I understood exactly what you were saying about the way the stock market works, but my question is, if I've understood you correctly, there's a need with as productivity increases, so as profits go up,
Yeah.
there's like a what would be best for a capitalist corporation would be to grow gradually, but there's some sort of driver in there that forces them to need to expand rapidly because of the drop in the overall value that you mentioned on the other side. Have I understood that right? I'm sort of struggling a bit. I'm not sure if I understood what you said correctly.
Yeah, well, no, I am struggling a bit with it as well, but I do think it's I mean, I've looked at the Roberts Harvey debate, And what I said was, I think it's naive, and we need to look at the real mechanics of the way capitalism works. Okay, okay. So what am I getting at? So far, Marx is just talking about industrial capital, right? In actual fact, of course, he then comes on to banking capital, and of course he says, well, the gross profit, as John's saying, right? They call it earnings before interest and taxation, right? EBIT. Uh, Earnings before interest and taxation will have taxation and interest taken out of it. Okay. So one of the things is that the banks will get their interest rate. That's an example of a capital market, right? The banks are lending the productive capitalist money, right? But there's all other kinds of capital markets involved, right? And each of those capital markets has got a way of assessing profitability, right? And they're all taking a slice of the pie, right? So when you talk about rate of profit and mass of profit, I think we actually have to be quite careful, right? Because these dynamics have got a feedback loop onto the industrial capitalist. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So the executives of the industrial capital, they all very proudly do this, right? In their annual report, return of capital employed is 15% this year. All jolly good. Your utilities will be such and such, so the share price goes up, the share price goes down, right? That's a return on investment, okay, for the share price. So there's a further mediation. So yeah, and sorry, I haven't given you a good answer to your question. It's an area that we should collectively look at.
Okay. We're over time a little bit, but it's okay. Andy, thank you very much.